She introduced me to his parents with a laugh in her voice, like I was the punchline to a joke she'd been saving all evening. "This is my dad," she said, and then she paused. That little pause she always does before the part she thinks is funny. "Well, stepdad, he fixes things. Roofs, decks, whatever people need. He's very good with his hands." His mother smiled politely. His father nodded the way men nod when they don't know what to say. And my daughter, who I watched learn to ride a bike in the parking lot of a Kmart of a Tuesday morning, whose college application essays I read 4 times each and cried at every single one. She turned back to the table like she'd just explained what kind of cheese was on the appetizer plate. I sat with my water glass and didn't say anything. I'd gotten good at that over the years. My wife and I married when her daughter was 9. She was a quiet kid back then, a little guarded the way kids are when their world has been rearranged without their permission. I didn't try to replace anyone. I never called myself her father, never pushed her to call me dad. I just showed up, fixed her bike when the chain kept slipping, drove her to soccer practice when her mother had double shifts at the hospital, made pancakes on Saturday mornings because that was the one thing I knew how to do well enough to impress a 9-year-old. By the time she was 12, she started calling me dad by accident, then on purpose. By the time she was 17, we had our thing. Bad action movies on Friday nights, arguing about which fast food place had the best fries, her stealing my flannel shirts because she said they were vintage aesthetic, which apparently meant old and soft. I thought we were solid. I really did. I don't know exactly when the shift happened. Somewhere in her mid-20s, after she got a good job in Boston, after she started dating Arthur, who came from a family with a compound in Connecticut and a last name that appeared on a library wing. Something changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was more like a slow tide going out. Calls got shorter. She stopped asking my opinion on things. When she visited, she was always half somewhere else, checking her phone, talking about people I didn't know in a register I didn't recognize. I told myself it was just growing up. That's what they do. My wife saw it differently, but she didn't say much either. We developed a habit of protecting each other from things we couldn't fix. The engagement dinner was held at a restaurant in Boston that charged $42 for a piece of halibut. I know because I looked at the menu for a long time trying to find something that felt reasonable and couldn't. I wore my good blazer, the navy one I'd bought for my nephew's wedding 3 years ago. And I got my hair cut the week before. My wife wore the green dress she always gets compliments in. Arthur's family was already seated when we arrived. His parents, I'll call them what they were, people who had never once needed to wonder if they could afford something, stood to greet us with a particular warmth, a very comfortable being gracious. His mother was elegant in the way that requires decades of practice. His father had the handshake of a man who'd given a lot of them. We sat down. Wine appeared. Minus appeared. Someone said something about the weather in a way that meant we were all trying. My daughter was lit up that night in a way I hadn't seen in a while. Happy. Genuinely happy. And I was glad for that. I want to be clear about that. Whatever else I felt that evening, I was glad she was happy. The trouble started when Arthur's father asked what I did. It's a simple question. People ask it constantly. I've answered it 10,000 times. I run a small contracting business, I said. Mostly residential. Roofing, additions, some renovation work. He nodded. Good, honest work, he said, in the tone people use when they mean it as a compliment, and don't realize it also sounds like a verdict. My daughter jumped in before I could say anything else. He's basically a handyman, she said, and she laughed a little. Not a cruel laugh. Just easy. Casual. Like it was a thing you could say. If something breaks in the neighborhood, everyone calls him. He's the go-to guy. The table smiled. Arthur's mother tilted her head in that way that meant she was being generous. That's wonderful, she said. It's so important to have someone reliable like that. I picked up my wine glass. I looked at my daughter. She was already talking about something else. I want to tell you I felt something clean, like anger. Anger is simple. Anger has edges you can hold on to. What I felt was more like standing in a doorway between 2 rooms and not being sure which one was mine anymore. My wife touched my hand under the table. I turned my palm up and held hers. Arthur's father, a man named Beau, which is a name you can only have if you've never had to worry about being taken seriously, was telling a story about a renovation project on their lake house that had gone sideways. The contractor had been unreliable, left things half-finished, charged them for work that wasn't done. "It's hard to find good people," he said, which seemed to be directed at the table generally. "It really is," my daughter agreed, in a voice that did not loop back to me. I thought about saying something. I ran through the sentences in my head, considered their weights, decided against. Arthur, to his credit, seemed to feel the texture of the evening in a way that embarrassed him slightly. He asked me a few questions, real ones. What kind of projects I liked best, how long I'd been in the business. He was attentive in the way young men are when they're trying to do right by their father-in-law and not entirely sure how. "What's the biggest job you've taken on?" he asked at one point. I thought about that. "We did a full rebuild of a municipal recreation center about 8 years ago," I said. "Town of Millbridge, New Hampshire. The original structure had fire damage. We brought in about 40 workers over 18 months. There was a pause at the table. "Wow," Arthur said. "I didn't know you did projects that scale." My daughter smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dad always undersells himself," she said, and the way she said it made it sound like a character flaw rather than a quality. Arthur's mother, whose name was Constance, had gone quiet on her side of the table. "I noticed it the way you notice weather changing. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in pressure." She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She leaned slightly forward. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't mean to be rude. But were you ever based in Vermont? Specifically Burlington?" I set down my fork. "I was, yes. For about 15 years before we moved to Massachusetts." Constance put her hand flat on the table. "Alderman Construction," she said. It wasn't a question. The table went quiet. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to pull back for a moment. "Yes," I said. "Ted Alderman," she said. And now she was sitting up straighter, and there was something in her face that was not the polite graciousness of an hour ago. "You built the Hargrove Center. You built the Hargrove Center. You built the Millstone Commons development. You built my sister's house. The one on Lakeview, that was your company." "It was," I said. "I have been in that house," she said, and she was looking at me like she was recalculating something, like she was looking at a painting she'd walked past 100 times and suddenly understood was a masterpiece. "That house is extraordinary, the craftsmanship in that house. I've told my sister for 15 years that whoever built it was an artist." The word landed on the table and stayed there. My daughter had gone very still. "Wait," Arthur said, and I could see him working something out. "Dad, Alderman Construction. That company sold to Griffin Partners about 12 years ago. I know that deal. I've actually read about that deal. That was like a $40-something million acquisition." 43, I said. Silence. Not the polite silence of people between sentences. The real kind. The kind that has weight. I don't tell people about the sale. I never have. My wife knew, of course. We'd been together for 2 years by then. And I told her when things got serious because she deserved to know what she was walking into. But I didn't advertise it. Money has a way of changing how people look at you. And I spent most of my life being looked at straight. And I liked it that way. After I sold Alderman Construction to Griffin Partners, I could have retired. A lot of people thought I would. Instead, I took 6 months off, drove around New England in a truck I'd had for 12 years, did some fishing, fixed up our back deck, thought about what I actually liked doing. What I liked doing was the work, not the managing of the work, not the contracts and the payroll and the liability insurance, but the actual physical problem of a structure, a roof that needed to be right, a foundation that had to hold. I went back to contracting at about 1/10 of the scale I'd been at, just me and a small crew, residential jobs in the towns around us. My wife thought I was crazy. I told her it kept me sane. It did. I didn't need the income. We lived comfortably, not extravagantly. My daughter grew up in a good house in a good school district, went to a good college, graduated without debt. I paid for it quietly and didn't make it a thing. Because it wasn't a thing. It was just being her father. Or trying to be. Constance was asking me about the Lakeview house, how we'd done the timber framing, how we'd handled the site drainage. Bo had turned to face me fully, and his whole posture had shifted in the way people's posture shifts when they realize they've been looking at something wrong. Arthur was on his phone. He looked up. Okay, I just pulled it up. They profiled you in Vermont Business Magazine. You were on the board of the State Contractors Association for 6 years. He stopped, looked at me. You're kind of a big deal in New England construction. I said. I'm mostly just a guy with a truck now. Constance laughed, not the polite kind, a real one. My daughter had not said a word in several minutes. I could feel her stillness the way you feel a held breath. My wife squeezed my hand again under the table. I knew what it meant. She'd been waiting 20 years to squeeze my hand like that. After dinner, Arthur's family said their goodbyes with a warmth that had a different quality than it had at the beginning of the evening. Constance hugged me, actually hugged me, and said she hoped we'd have more time together at the wedding. In the parking garage, my wife went ahead with Arthur's parents to say goodbye at their car, and my daughter and I were alone for a moment. She was quiet for a long time. We walked between parked cars and neither of us said anything. Why didn't you ever tell me? She finally said. I thought about how to answer that. Tell you what, I said. That I built things. You knew I built things. Dad! Her voice cracked on the word, and it was the old voice, the 12-year-old voice, the one that used to call from the other room when she had a nightmare. You know what I mean? I know, I said. We stopped at our car. The garage hummed around us. Somewhere below us a car was trying to start. I didn't tell you the numbers because the numbers were never the point, I said. The point was showing up, driving you to practice, making pancakes, being there. That was the point, not the number. She was crying. She wasn't making a big production of it, just standing there with tears going down her face in the fluorescent light of the parking garage. And she looked young in a way she hadn't looked in a long time. I'm sorry, she said. For tonight, for the way I'm sorry. I know you are. I didn't think. She stopped. I know, I said. She reached out and I put my arm around her, the way I used to when she was little. And she leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a minute we just stood there. I called you a handyman. She said quietly against my shoulder. I am a handyman, I said. A handyman is someone who shows up and fixes what's broken. I've never been embarrassed by that. She made a small sound that was something between a laugh and something else entirely. On the drive home, my wife reached across the console and held my hand. We drove for a while without the radio. You could have said something, she said eventually, at the table. I know. You were letting her do it. I wasn't letting her do anything, I said. I just wasn't stopping her. There's a difference. My wife looked at me for a moment in the way she has after 30 years of knowing someone very well. Is there? She said. I thought about that for a while. Maybe not, I said. We passed through a stretch of highway where the trees came right up to the edge of the road and the headlights made them glow. I'd driven this stretch 1,000 times. I built 2 houses about a mile off to the left, back in the 90s. Good houses. Still standing. She called me a handyman, I said, in front of people she was trying to impress. And I sat there and let her because I thought, I don't know what I thought, that she needed to, that she was nervous, that it cost me nothing. Did it cost you nothing? I thought about the 9-year-old with the broken bike chain. The college applications, I cried her. The flannel shirts, she said, were vintage aesthetic. No, I said. I think it cost me something. My wife didn't say anything. She just held my hand tighter. The wedding is in October. I'll be there in my good suit. I'll dance with my daughter the way I danced with her at her prom when her date didn't show up and she called me from the school parking lot. And I drove over in my work clothes, still smelling like sawdust. And we slow danced in the gym while her friends pretended not to notice. She called me last week, talked for an hour, asked about the Milford job we're doing, the one with the complicated dormer situation. Asked me to tell her about the Hargrove Center, what it felt like when they cut the ribbon, whether I'd cried. I told her I hadn't cried at the ribbon cutting. I told her I'd cried when we poured the foundation. Because that's when you know it's real. She was quiet for a moment. That's so you, she said, and the way she said it sounded like what it was. Someone seeing a person they'd be looking past, and finally looking straight at him. I'm 63 years old. I've built things that will outlast me by 100 years. I raised a daughter who isn't even mine by blood, and loved her like she was my whole reason for being here, which she mostly was. I'm just a guy with a truck. That's always been enough. I keep thinking about that parking garage, the fluorescent light, the sound of a car somewhere below us that wouldn't start, my daughter leaning her head against my shoulder and saying quietly, like she was ashamed of the words even as she said them, "I called you a handyman." What I didn't tell her, standing there between those parked cars, is that the moment didn't hurt the way she thought it did. It hurt differently. It hurt the way things hurt when you realize you let them happen. When you understand that silence, chosen long enough, teaches people what you're worth. I had spent years showing up without explaining myself, and somewhere along the way my daughter had filled in the explanation herself, and it was small. That wasn't entirely her fault. That was partly mine. There's something I've come to understand about the way consequences work, not as punishment, but as information. The things we do or don't do accumulate. Constance didn't recognize me because of luck. She recognized me because 40 years ago I made a decision that the work would be done right, even when no one was checking, even when cutting corners would have saved money and no one would have known. That house on Lakeview. My daughter's future mother-in-law had stood in that house for 15 years, calling it extraordinary. She didn't know my name. She just knew the house was honest. The work told the truth even when I didn't. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't announce itself. It just stays. It shows up in a conversation 20 years later and quietly sets the record straight without you having to say a word. I've watched people build things with shortcuts and bluster, and I've watched those things fail. I've watched people carry their worth loudly, performing it for every room they walked into. I never wanted to live like that, but I think I overcorrected. Humility that goes unexamined can look, from the outside, like you agree with the people who underestimate you. My daughter is a smart woman. She reads situations. She adapts. But intelligence without the willingness to look at someone closely. Really look, past what they drive and what they wear and how they describe themselves. That intelligence is just a faster way to arrive at the wrong conclusion. What she learned that night wasn't that her stepdad was secretly rich. I hope she learned something harder than that. I hope she learned that she had been looking at me for years and not actually seeing me, and that the cost of that kind of not looking is paid eventually, one way or another. She called last week, talked for an hour, asked real questions, listened to the answers. That's the thing about people. They can change if something wakes them up. She had the character for it all along. She just needed a moment in a restaurant in Boston, where a woman she wanted to impress looked across the table and told her, without meaning to, that the man she'd been calling a handyman had built something that took her breath away. I didn't need her to know the number. I needed her to see me. She finally did. That's enough. That has always been enough.